It suddenly got very quiet. Does that mean we're ready to start? Woo! Woo! I get to be important. Okay. So I think we will get started in a second. If you want to take, do we need extra chairs? Should we put out, there's some extra chairs on the side. Yeah, you're free to pull out a couple extra chairs if we need it. This is actually, it's nice. Oh, Chris will help pull out chairs. Okay. So please feel free to sit or get some food and then sit. Be merry. We're going to get started. A couple of little housekeeping questions. If you are looking for the restroom, it is out that door and to the right. There's a men's and a women's room just on the side. And one small note before we kick this off to our special guest. I just wanted to take a moment to welcome you all to Home Sweet CASA. My name's Elaine Wong. I'm one of the co-founders of Palo Alto Forward, which is one of the sponsoring organizations of this group. And I also wanted to just take a few minutes to recognize all of our excellent co-hosts. So Menlo Together, we will hear from Karen in a minute, but if you're from Menlo Together, can you raise your hand real quick? And if you're in Menlo Park and want to connect with Menlo Together, please feel free to reach out to these folks. Silicon Valley at Home, who is Michael Lane's organization. Do we have anybody else from Silicon Valley at Home? You're the only one, okay. And San Mateo Housing Leadership Coalition? Council, sorry, Housing Leadership Council. Sorry, Angie. Do you guys want to stand and just... And we have a number of other community groups. Redwood City Forward, anybody from Redwood City Forward? Livable Sunnyvale, Peninsula for Everyone. Is Kelsey here? Oh, Peninsula for Everyone. Do you guys want to say one thing about your organization?
So we are an affiliate club of Unity Action, so yes in my backyard. We are very newly formed, so we don't have a website yet, but we will soon. But if you're interested, you could just email at peninsulaforeveryone@gmail.com and kind of work at the intersection of housing, transportation, and equity issues.
Thank you. And the League of Women Voters Palo Alto, want to give a special shout out. Do you guys want to, Bonnie and Lisa, do you want to just stand and say who you are and what you've been doing?
We've been advocating for more housing supply for years and years and years, especially in Palo Alto. But if you want to change public policy, vote. We do a lot. We're nonpartisan, and we do a lot to ensure that people are well educated when they vote. They know what they're voting on, and we do it.
Thank you. And then last but not least, the finance. Are you here? Okay. Well, I'm going to turn this event over to Karen Grove from Menlo Together.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Grove, and I co-founded with Adina Levin, Menlo Together, which brings people together with expertise on issues of housing, transportation, environmental sustainability, and equity, because we recognize that all of those things are inextricably linked. So I wanted to let you all know that we're going to record tonight's presentation, and afterwards we will email everybody for whom we have an email with a link to the recording so you can share it with other people who couldn't be here today. And we'll also send out some information about all the sponsoring and co-host organizations so that you can connect with them easily if you want to. Just, any of these organizations are great ways to be engaged and to get involved and share your expertise and passion to solve the problems that we have. So tonight we have the honor and the pleasure to welcome Michael Lane, the Deputy Director of Silicon Valley at Home. And he's going to share some context regarding the regional housing crisis and then give us an overview of a regional initiative to address the crisis called CASA. The housing crisis has many causes and affects all of us in some way. The problem has come about for many reasons and likewise will require all of us to work together to find and implement solutions. So we all came here this evening to hear about this the solutions that came out of the CASA process. And I'm sure that we're all going to have a lot of questions, and we want to answer as many of them as we can. So that's what these little index cards on your chair are for. Please write your questions on the cards, and that way we can bundle similar questions and get to as many as possible. So now I'm pleased to introduce Michael. Michael found his passion for affordable housing for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas and started Self-Help Enterprises, which is the oldest and largest nonprofit developer of mutual self-help housing in the nation. Since 2011, Michael has served as the policy director for nonprofit housing, which supports nonprofit housing by working on local, regional, state, and federal policy and funding initiatives. He's been instrumental over the years in ensuring many wins for affordable housing, including the recent passage of last year's slate of 15 housing bills. Michael graduated from San Francisco State University, and he speaks fluent Spanish, and this is my favorite part. He's a former city council member for the city of Visalia. Go Central Valley. Yeah. He has served on numerous boards, including our very own Housing Leadership Council. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. Can you hear me okay? Is that working? Great. Well, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be with housing advocates. And for those who are hosting, our housing advocacy work is so important. It's appropriate to have it at a church, right? Because sometimes we feel like this is mission kind of a field here, and we're looking for converts to come over to the pro-housing side. So the work's very challenging. We've got very passionate people and very intelligent people working on the case, and so it's wonderful to be here with you tonight. And what I'll do is I'll just motion when we're going to go through the slides here very quickly to give you kind of an overview of what the CASA Compact is. Home Sweet CASA, Tackling the Regional Housing Crisis is our theme tonight. Some people say CASA is a four-letter word, but it actually just means house in Spanish, right? So we want to make that clear out at the start. Thank you. So CASA began about, now it's been almost 2 years, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments actually formed this working group called the Committee to House the Bay Area, and it really comes out of Plan Bay Area 2040 and the whole emphasis on reducing vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions, tackle climate change, and we had a very robust program called the Regional Transportation Plan, which, although it's always not the kind of sufficient funding we would need for transportation, at least it is funded with federal and state resources coming through to actually build out a transportation plan. However, on the housing side, all we have is what we call RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, but we have no funding to go along with that typically. Significant cuts at the federal level. For many years, we had no resource at the state level until very recently voters passed bonds in the last election. But it's really been hit or miss, and on a kind of a cycle where you pass a bond, you spend those dollars, and then you have to go back to the voters on a regular basis. And that's how we fund housing. And so the idea was to bring these all together in Plan Bay Area, but then to really beef up the housing resources. And as you know, MTC and ABAG have recently merged, so our transportation and housing agencies have to work even more closely together than ever before. So you can see the structure here. We had 3 co-chairs and a steering committee of 18 members who made up labor, environment, local government, the private sector to provide guidance. But then we also had a technical committee of 32 members, people who were in the field trying to develop housing, addressing homelessness, various aspects of housing finance, land use, zoning, those kinds of things, to be able to put together a package and do that ground truthing and actually bring that experience and expertise that they had to make sure that the program that was developed would pass muster and could actually work in the world. And then you see we have outreach with our CBOs, nonprofit organizations doing grassroots organizing to also share the word, what was happening, having input, lots of public meetings and hearings and opportunities for the public to speak on the items. And then local jurisdiction outreach. There's 101 jurisdictions in the Bay Area, so obviously not every jurisdiction could be on the committees. We did have members of the boards of supervisors, and from some cities though. And then ABAG has a regional planning committee and a subcommittee of housing where we also have small cities participating. And the idea would be that those members would then go back to their fellow council members, supervisors, and share what was happening through the CASA process. Once again, this didn't just appear last December overnight. Deus Ex Machina was actually a long process, and people knew it was happening, and it came right out of Plan Bay Area, which is the SCS that is required under SB 375, which is now over a decade old. So that was the genesis of the CASA committee. And this is the framework we're going to talk about next, what we call the 3 Ps: production, protection, and preservation. But first, to give some of the context, as you all know, fundamental problem is the jobs housing gap, but also jobs housing fit, to the extent that we are building housing because it is so expensive to build. And if you don't have sufficient subsidies to provide subsidized affordable housing, then it tends to be higher income housing, even though you're creating jobs at all wage levels. And so we have a particular dearth of housing for those at 50% of AMI and below. And of course, for homelessness, that's a whole another emphasis as well, where you really need what we call ELI, extremely low income housing, to be able to meet those needs. But these are the gaps, and you can see in 13 to 1 here, 17 to 1 in Santa Clara, jobs added, and then housing permits lagging far behind. And then here's the demand. You can see what the RENA is versus the actual production, continuing to generate a deficit, not keeping up with growth in population, and we were already in a bind before the recent economic recovery. Yes? Can you explain the slides a little bit, because it's really hard to. Okay. So, yeah. So what, this is job growth. Job growth, very strong at various income levels. The actual housing production is the red. And then the RENA were the goals that were set out from the state. Now, what you can see from this, I'm sorry, I said the blue is the RENA, is the need. And then this was actually the production. So the RENA numbers were already low. That's the allocation that we're given based on household formation, new births, economic growth, et cetera. The Department of Finance works with HCD to come up with those numbers and then sends them out to each region. And that's the goal. What happened is, though, those numbers had actually, for this last RENA cycle, were determined really at the bottom of the Great Recession, around 2010 or so, as you're just coming out. And so no one foresaw at that time the near, as they say, full employment that we're seeing here, particularly along the peninsula and in Silicon Valley. And so those RENA numbers are low, admittedly, but we're not even meeting the lower numbers, is kind of the point there, I think. Oh, low income, moderate income, and high income. And so you can see the job growth, too, is tilted that way. And the housing that is being produced tends to be above moderate income housing. So it's just kind of underlying the disparities in the need versus what's actually being produced. Next slide. Patterns of resegregation in the Bay Area are occurring as a result. There's a new report I just wanted to point out to you to go look it up if you'd like to. It's on this website, the California Housing Partnership website, chpc.net. You can get this. It was just released fairly recently, working with UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project, just seeing how the pressures of gentrification and displacement are forcing out lower income and communities of color out of historic neighborhoods. In the Bay Area, there's tremendous pressure on the housing stock, and then higher income people are buying up properties, improving them, et cetera, and putting pressure on rents in those areas, as you all well know. So I just wanted to point out this document, but that was also part of the context and why CASA was formed, to begin to address these types of pressures. But you can see historically black cities and neighborhoods across the region lost thousands of low-income households. They're moving farther and farther out to the outskirts of the Bay Area, and we're becoming really a more affluent, white, gated community, unfortunately, here in the inner core of the Bay. And so that's just a couple takeaways. Could we go to the next slide? And then the other thing is the waves of displacement is actually people just moving altogether out of the region, not even just to the periphery of the region, but actually leaving the region entirely or the state. And just wanted to point out in particular, upon moving, a substantial share of low-income people left the region altogether. Approximately 30% of low-income people of color who moved in 2015 left the Bay Area entirely. And so we see that we have lower income and people of color moving out of our region, and higher income people in search of those high paying jobs coming in. And those are the additional pressures that we see in terms of housing costs and migration, and then concentrations and segregation of poverty in the region for those who do find a way to stay. So enter CASA, and the work product of those 18 months and hundreds of hours of committee meetings were what we call elements of the compact, various elements that address the 3 Ps that we had talked about. So protection is the first P, protection of existing tenants in their neighborhoods, try to stabilize rents, keep people in their homes. Preservation of existing affordable housing is very important, particularly when the financing sources and those deeds, the regulatory agreements and the deed restrictions run out. Then those are in danger of becoming market rate units, and then you could see economic evictions, and like we've seen, of course, on the peninsula and the valley. So ways to preserve existing housing stock, because if you're just losing what you already have, then you can never get out of the hole in the deficit that you've created. And then finally, production of both new market rate and affordable housing. The idea there being, there's a lot of talk about moderate income. Some could call it missing middle. Missing middle is both a building typology and a demographic. But really the ideal way to get to that moderate income housing is to produce enough market rate housing so it has a little bit of downward pressure. I don't think anyone says that just building more market rate is going to solve ELI or for homelessness. It's not intended to do that. But it can help sort of the mid-level kind of managers or professionals or teachers or nurses and others who are key to our communities but don't necessarily make the high salaries, of course, that tech does, and still need to be able to live near their work. And so that's why we want that kind of production, but also obviously we need to ramp up our production of subsidized housing as well for those particularly below 50% of AMI and below. And so that's the framework to build the house of CASA, as it were. And so you can see we have tenant protections in the first elements. We also have accessory dwelling units as a component of this. Not that ADUs are going to solve the whole problem either, but it can, in a relatively straightforward way, with a relatively small carbon footprint, add capacity to existing lots. In many cases, we have larger lots where there are opportunities to put up ADUs, but there have been barriers that have been created by local governments, both on the regulatory side, just the expense and design review and some of the things that are required at the local level to make it harder to do the ADUs and there's been legislation, as you know, over the past few years on this in Sacramento, and we've already got a bunch of other bills, which we can talk about later, that have been introduced already in this new legislative session to streamline ADU approvals. Production incentives, which would be in some ways upzoning and streamlining to take advantage of the existing urban footprint, but to make sure we're using that land, that valuable land, as efficiently as possible. When it costs as much as $15 million an acre to get land that you can then develop, you can imagine that really puts some constraints on what you're able to do in terms of delivering affordability. Surplus public land, to the extent that we do have public land, we need to dedicate that for affordable housing and get a right of first refusal, whether it's municipal at the county level, Caltrain, for example. I know many of you are working with Caltrain on a public lands policy. That's really important. And then potential funding sources for our region to be able to ramp up and be able to finance the work that we want to do here. What are those funding sources? What do they look like? And then a regional housing entity. This is not a new bureaucracy per se, but it would be housed at MTC and ABAG with their existing staff, but then also with some additional specialists. But the idea would be to not a regulatory body, not coming down on cities, but really try to provide technical assistance and support, best practices, data, particularly for smaller cities that don't have a lot of staff necessarily in a housing department per se, or a community development department, but could use some support from the regional bodies to help make sure that we have a level playing field for our cities, across the region. So I'll just go briefly through the elements quickly to give you a sense of what they are. Just cause eviction. Assemblymember Rob Bonta from Oakland had run a bill in the last session that didn't make it out. He's coming back. I don't know if many of you may have seen the press conference this morning in Sacramento. There's a package of tenant protection bills that has been rolled out, and Assemblymember Bonta's bill is one of those. that will be in that package of bills. Just cause, fault and no fault for evictions, just to clarify so that tenants know exactly what the rules are and what they need to do in order not to be evicted. If they are evicted, why, and they have that clearly explained, et cetera. Experts had cited the New Jersey laws. Some of our local jurisdictions have fairly good ordinances, like Mountain View, for example, has a good ordinance. The city of San Diego has an ordinance that people were looking at. But so track that bill, and later in the presentation I can give you some bill numbers if you'd like to kind of look these up. They're currently what we call spot bills, but they will be amended soon with substantive language. Element number 2 is a rent cap. You probably saw the state of Oregon just recently, their legislature just passed a rent cap, and that's moving to the governor's desk. This came out of CASA, but there's also interest in Sacramento doing something statewide. Initially, the CASA compact was thought of as Bay Area only, 9 counties for a 15-year period as an emergency. And that's the way this agreement was crafted among our stakeholders in the Bay Area. But of course, in other parts of the state, they're facing similar challenges, both in the high-cost coastal areas, but also in the more suburban and rural parts of our state. They may have somewhat different challenges, but they have housing instability and precarity as well. So the idea about the rent cap was, could we sit down with tenant advocates, with the California Apartment Association, with real estate interests, with market rate developers, and figure out something that everyone could live with? This thought would be something different. As you know, there have been battles in the legislature and then on the ballot last November over rent control, repeal of Costa-Hawkins, vacancy control, all those issues that were in play. But what this did was said, for this emergency period, it's kind of like an anti-gouging statute that we already have when there's a natural disaster, so that vendors aren't jacking up prices and taking advantage of people when there's a shortage of some particular basic human need. So we have a housing crisis as well, and so let's treat that this way as well, because we've seen some really egregious examples of rent increases that were double digits over time, and even more than that, 100% in some cases. Instant economic evictions. And so could we come in with CPI plus 5% and then have some provisions for exemptions and, for example, improvements to the property? Could there be some pass-through? Oakland has an ordinance like that allows for that. And then a banking provision when the full rent is not charged. But this would also apply to new construction. And so you'd get a lot more coverage than you currently have with rent control ordinances because of Costa-Hawkins, which are either limited to buildings before 1995 or in larger cities that already had rent control, in some cases 1979, for example, like in the case of San Jose. So controversial, but we're able to get equity advocates and the development community to agree on this, which was not an easy thing to do. Okay, this one's a little bit blurry. Rent assistance and access to legal counsel. There again, could we have a fund at the regional level that if someone misses a rent payment, is there a way that for a good reason could they get some assistance just so that they could remain in that unit and not end up becoming homeless or have to find some place to move, and to set up a program like that. And then access to free legal counsel so people know their rights if they are facing eviction. The idea there was, could we fund legal services attorneys to try to help with this and provide more support for those who are in precarious housing situations facing eviction. I would also, just as an aside, I would say that some of the state legislators had been watching the work that CASA did and also wanted to take this to the state level. So our Senator Nancy Skinner from Berkeley has a bill at the state level that would do some of this work as well. That's SB 18. Okay, ADUs, I won't spend much time on this because I think many of you are familiar with what we're trying to accomplish here, but the idea would be you could really bring down the cost and make it affordable to do these if you even get to the point where you could almost just drop them in as a modular kind of a construction where you have off-the-shelf plans, pre-approved, et cetera, just come in and do that. And one of the advantages of that is that it makes it less expensive per unit. You could do some of these for $30,000 or $40,000 perhaps, but also there's work to limit the fees that can be charged on these as well. And then also junior ADUs, which are part of an existing larger structure would be included. But one of the ideas is that there's more emphasis on modular construction now, even for market rate development. But because it's such a cyclical type of an industry, that when there's a downturn, then they tend to wipe out those manufacturers. But if you had an ongoing program of ADUs, there would be work to do conceivably, even in a downturn, if you had a less expensive product that you're trying to bring forward. Okay, number 5, minimum zoning near transit. I'll just say quickly, this has a lot of the outline of what's in Senator Wiener's SB 50, which I know some people aren't so happy about around here. But in fairness, I just have to say SB 50 is going to happen with or without the CASA process. It was already going forward. It had been introduced before the compact had even been adopted. As you know, Senator Wiener had worked on a similar bill in the previous session, but over the recess, he spent a lot of time with advocates across the state. He spent a lot of time in Los Angeles talking about what he could do to improve the legislation from the last session and come back with upzoning, particularly major transit stops. So that's just rail and ferry, where we've got billions of dollars in investment in transportation, and it doesn't make sense to do low density or single family around that investment. So that's why the state would step in on that. And that's just a quarter-mile radius up to 55 feet for those buildings. And then you can see half-mile. This is the CASA version. This is not what's in Wiener's bill. Wiener says a half-mile out, you could go up to 45 feet. And he does not talk about high-quality bus surface in terms of heights, but just additional density. And then additionally in SB 50, you can get additional density but not height for what he calls job-rich or communities of opportunity, neighborhoods of opportunity, where you may have high-performing schools and lots of jobs. The transit may not be as robust, but there also is a need for affordable housing there. But it's not going to be taller multifamily buildings. But the idea is, could you do duplexes, triplexes, quads, like we used to do before that kind of zoning became illegal, a few decades ago. And so there is a provision for what we call sensitive communities, and it kind of mirrors the maps that you had seen by the Urban Displacement Project. And the idea is we're low-income communities who are in the urban core, where there may be robust transit and already have been upzoned to some degree. Could we give them a grace period of 5 years to work on community plans to make sure we're protecting those neighborhoods and those residents there before the upzoning takes place? And so that was an attempt to address concerns about taller buildings leading to displacement, gentrification. And so that's in the CASA Compact and also in SB 50. And these are just some of the transit access areas that you can see there, and then the sensitive communities in red. High quality bus service in orange there, trying to get more density along those lines and corridors and station areas. Element 6 is about good government reforms, just kind of bringing more transparency, consistency, predictability to what we call the entitlement process. When you go in and get your entitlements, that means your approvals to be able to then build something. Can we make sure that we know what the fees are ahead of time? Can we have a menu that's clear, it's posted on the website, etc.? Can we look at the methodology for is there a standard methodology that could be adopted for how we do the feasibility, feasibility for fees and the nexus study, as it's called. As we produce those, could HCD have a role to make sure that whatever's being produced is actually is ground truth, and there's an accepted methodology that's being used for those fees, because fees vary tremendously from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, even jurisdiction with comparable costs of living, land costs, etc. And so that's kind of what this particular element is about. Not a CEQA repeal, but could we limit de novo public hearings and design review approvals to 12 months? They don't get stretched out. And then no double burden, things like that. You don't. If you provide affordable housing on site, you don't also then have to pay a fee. You do one or the other. As you know, there's tremendous controversy in San Francisco now over their inclusionary ordinance, which is on its way ratcheting up to 25%, when the feasibility showed that it really needed to be less than that. And so if we don't do it right, inclusionary can be used as a tool to stop development, and we don't want that. but it is a tool for integration. It's not going to produce all the housing you need, but it does make sure that in developments we do have some socioeconomic integration. Expedited approvals and financial incentives. This is similar, but not exactly like SB 35 from the previous session, which streamlined some housing. What this bill would do is, it's really particularly, or if it becomes legislation, what it would do is try to get to this missing middle idea. 80 to, this is 150, in some cases 80 to 120, it's depending on the expense of the area. But the idea is, could you create significant incentives without direct public subsidy in terms of setbacks and parking requirements, limiting those, providing density bonuses, but also still having community benefits like prevailing wages, which was in requirement in SB 35. And the inclusionary, though, would be larger. Let's say you do 20%, but it can be more high income targeted for that 80 to 120 band. The idea is to try to serve more of that particular population without having to provide your precious and finite subsidies for higher income people. And that way you can keep those subsidies for more deeply income targeted units. So you can see these are all just kind of cost drivers that they're trying to address as a way to bring more affordability on site. And that's kind of the developer agrees to do that if you get some of these incentives. Public land, I think that's pretty straightforward, as you know. Some jurisdiction would prefer just to do commercial development or to max out their ability to profit off the sale or lease of land. And we're saying, no, first it's public land for public good. No, we should first have a right of first refusal. We have state law saying that, but there's been all attempts to circumvent that and litigation, et cetera. And so Assemblymember Phil Ting will be running a bill again to clarify more in this particular area of the law about how that process should go to really make sure we're programming this precious and valuable resource of public land for affordable housing. Funding to finance the compact is needed, as we had said. As you know, we had a regional measure 3, for example, which was the bridge tolls. We had Save the Bay, as you'll remember, which was a parcel tax. Regional measures are not as frequent. You don't see those as often as you would see like a city or county level revenue measure. But are there various revenue measures? Some will go to the ballot, others could be adopted because it's existing authority by a vote of your elected officials. But that was the idea, is could we spread the pain, as it were, so it's not no one group is bearing the entire burden of the cost, but make sure employers, developers, property owners who benefit from Prop 13, for example, are all participating to try to help us solve this problem, because it really does go to our quality of life. And so in the end, it's all of our enlightened self-interest to try to tackle this and fund it. So this was, I think, one of the slides that scared some of our local officials, because they thought this was, CASA was mandating this. These were really just a series of ideas about how we could potentially fund this. This is not exhaustive. It is not necessarily even the ones that would be adopted. What I've been telling people all the way through this is that there's still a lot of democracy ahead of us. This would have to be adopted in Sacramento. It would then be sent back to the region, which includes your board of supervisors and cities, who would then have to vote on this, even just to place it then before the voters, who would then vote on it. So as you know, it's a pretty democratic process in that regard. But I do know some jurisdictions kind of jumped on some of these and said, well, you're going to take away all of our 25% redevelopment revenue set aside. You're going to take away our property taxes. And then other interest groups were concerned about linkage fees and all the rest. But the idea was that the people, at least at the table, realized if we could spread this out over time in phases, then we can begin to generate some revenues that the state or federal government won't be able to provide for the region to really address the need. Also, as you can see, private philanthropy has been involved with their own loan funds here. They just announced some of that. Governor Newsom said he really expects tech to step up and participate with him to try to help solve some of the impacts that have been created through the job growth. Love the jobs, but they have real impacts on people's lives, and we need to be able to address those issues as well. So this is a series of proposals to be reviewed, additional research, et cetera. What would be the voter interest in approving some of these? Others may not poll very well at all, and you'll want to do all that work before you proceeded. And then finally, I mentioned this briefly, this is the regional housing enterprise. I want spend too much time on this particular slide, but once again, the idea was not to impose, but to provide additional support, particularly for smaller cities that don't have a large staff. And then these are kind of the windows. This was developed and adopted in 18 and early 19. The compact was then provided to our state legislature. They, of course, will take that work product and impose their own mark on it. And if bills start in the Assembly will do its thing, but then the Senate will want to leave its mark on the bills as well. And then hopefully at some point the governor will also intervene and will hopefully we'll be able to identify, once again, a set of bills as a package that the pro tem and the speaker and the governor could come around and say, yeah, we all are bought into this and support it. And one of the things we heard is that that's the value of the compact, that's the value of a package, is that there may be things in there you wouldn't vote for on a one-off basis, but if it's all together as a package and you know that some of the things you like, it's kind of a trade-off, and then you go along with things that you maybe don't like so much. That was the whole idea around CASA, that people came with an open mind and a willingness to negotiate and a willingness to accept some things that they weren't thrilled about, including the real estate interests who were at the table. And that's how we got there. And of course, is there a potential then to bring things to the ballot? Obviously, in March and November of 2020, huge voter turnout. Exciting time. All of our voters who tend to support affordable housing will be out. Could we put things on the ballot to help move that? Just as an aside, the 2/3 voter threshold is really tough. The city of San Jose had a $450 million general obligation bond, which they really needed, on the November ballot last November. Got 64% of the vote, but obviously it was over 64, but was a few percentage points shy. They got a higher percentage than Governor Newsom did when he won by a landslide as governor, and that's just because the 2/3 is a really high bar to hit. There's actually a constitutional amendment that's been introduced to reduce that voter threshold for measures like that to 55%, which is what it is for school facilities. We think that makes a lot of sense and is more democratic, actually. So this is a partial list. There's almost 200 bills that have been introduced about housing, but I thought I'd just pick some of the highlights for you to give you a sense of what's moving. And what you'll see the theme of the 3 Ps here. These are not all CASA bills, by the way, but I just wanted to let you know some of these are out there. Assemblymember Bloom from Santa Monica was at that press conference today. He's coming back with what he's calling it modifications to Costa-Hawkins now. There could be a rolling date in terms of when, which properties would be affected. That's one thing. They may look at vacancy control and stuff to some degree. Obviously, these are going to be big battles. Michael Weinstein also announced today that he's willing to come back in 2020 with another run at repealing Costa-Hawkins. He spent about $30 million last year on it. But the good news is that CASA has had impact. But our work is done. It's now up to the legislature. But they've adopted the 3 Ps framework as the comprehensive way to do this. And so we'll be tracking bills as they move. And then what CASA will be doing is identifying where these principles are represented in bills and where they're not, and support letters, support if amended. The participating member organizations will do that. MTC and ABAC have done their work now. They had adopted the compact as it was, as the document, but now it's up to the legislature and the governor to move through. I think that's probably the last slide, right? Great, thank you very much.
Question? I think you all had some question cards. If you wouldn't mind, just if you have questions, we'll write them down and we'll kind of group them together and give you an opportunity to ask. We have a couple just to kind of kick it off. I do. Yes. Thanks. Pass it around. I think there's a couple other. Does everyone have a card who needs a card? If you don't have a card, raise your hand. Okay, so I'm going to give these to you.
Okay.
There's 3 questions to start with.
Okay. Should I?
Go ahead.
Do you want to read them or for
No.
the audience? Okay. Can individuals own property and choose to offer reduced rent to low-income, moderate-income residents without being charged with discrimination? Yes, and actually we do have some benevolent landlords who actually make a point of limiting or even below, there are, below market kind of rental situations. Not a lot of them, but they may be financially well off, et cetera. We also do have philanthropic organizations that without public subsidies have units that they do rent out below market, and there's actually legislation to make sure that their property tax bills reflect what they're doing, because they're not charging market rate rents. Daughters of Charity, I think, have some properties like that who are doing that. So it can be done, but voluntary only gets you so far. We also have voluntary, mediation, for example, in some cases for when there is a conflict or when there's a potential for an eviction, and those haven't been, as successful. Can you briefly explain what CEQA is? So, how many know that CEQA was signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan? Well, what is CEQA? The California Environmental Quality Act. And so the idea is to review the impacts that a project will have on its environment in general, kind of just in general. But it can be very all-encompassing in terms of water quality, air quality, noise, traffic. And so you do this environmental impact review, as we call it, and then you determine what the impacts are for the project and how you're going to mitigate those. And they have already been predicted or foreseen and addressed when the general plan was adopted and the zoning code, et cetera, which the use that you're proposing was already approved there. And then you can just have what we call a negative declaration, which you'd say, there's no impact here because I'm just doing what this plan calls for. It's when you're changing that, et cetera, that you need to do your own environmental, because you can't, what we call, tear off the existing environmental document that was developed by the jurisdiction when it was putting those plans in place. But the basic idea is to protect our environment, give neighborhood a chance to address issues before the project moves forward. The problem is, of course, it's been used for other purposes as well, to leverage a developer, et cetera, to get certain community benefits, et cetera, or to kill projects altogether, because time is money, and if you've got a significant amount of investment, you've got carrying costs, et cetera, for a project, that's a way through litigation to kill a project. So it's a very controversial issue. CEQA reform is very difficult to do in the Capitol. Not for stadiums, though. For football stadiums, you can get that pretty easily. But not for housing, I guess I should have said. But, Oakland College, Oakland going to get it. The Kings Arena in Sacramento got it. LA is going to get one for their football team in Inglewood. So, and some legislators saying that's the point. We want this for housing, too, if we can do it for pro sports teams. But anyway, that's CEQA. Asked in an incredulous voice, isn't a rent cap the same thing as rent control? Won't a rent cap slow down new housing production? Did I do that right? So that was the debate, right, at the CASA combat. We actually had market rate developers at the table, like the Related Company, like Saris Regis, like Summerhill, Lennar. Did I mention Lennar? I'm sorry? What's that? And so the discussion was about, could we balance this where you're protecting tenants, but you're not just taking investment out of California and shifting it to another state, and then you just dampen supply and you just worsen your problem altogether, because it is, investment will go wherever it can. If you just create too many problems, it just won't want to invest in housing. That's why they do want to invest in commercial and office, because a lot of our jurisdictions up and down the peninsula and the valley, they keep permitting new office, right? And you're even on spec, et cetera. And so let's just go ahead and invest in that. But housing is much more difficult. And so that's just the easy way particularly for international investors, just to go with commercial or office. But so the question was, how could we do that where you had some protection, particularly among the most outrageous rent increases, so kind of a rent stabilization or anti-gouging program, but not dampen the market? Because remember, this applies to new construction as well. So one way that you would first address it is by you exempt new construction, typically if you have a rent control program. And you would allow a building to be built, and for that financing over the first like 15 years, et cetera, you would not apply, but then it would begin to apply after that to make sure you would not discourage construction. That's how the state of Oregon just did theirs, for example. It doesn't apply for the first 15 years. But in this case, what our developer members of the compact were saying is that they could make this work, even with new construction in California. They were recognizing the crisis. Do they love it? No. This is actually even stricter than the state of Oregon's, because like I said, the state of Oregon didn't apply to new construction. Theirs was CPI plus 7%, and this is CPI plus 5%. Obviously, advocates and most of us who, are renters would want it even tighter, but it is a significant expansion, and it would actually apply to jurisdictions that otherwise would never pass rent control of any form. So it would cover a lot more residents, in the Bay Area were it to be passed. But so that's basically the bottom line, is that the developers at the table, and they said they could make this work if they could also get some of the other aspects of the compact, like the streamlining, like the upzoning, that can actually enhance their work as well, in exchange for inclusionary and labor standards. So it felt like a pretty good deal.
We've got lots of questions.
Great.
I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to every one, but I would say start with that one. And there's a bunch about infrastructure, so I'm kind of...
Infrastructure.
So start with
Great.
those two, and then there's some
You bet.
infrastructure ones.
Housing supply process. Okay, so top down versus bottom down is the context. Housing supply process appears mostly a top-down strategy approach. May the process of increasing providing housing be done mostly with a bottom-up approach, surveys, and for feedback from those seeking housing. Does someone want to elaborate on what they were trying to get at there, just so I'm clear, so I can make sure I answer?
So right now,
Yeah.
we have a lot of authorities, right, developers, politicians, all talking to the community of people looking for housing.
Right.
And nobody's asking us what we want.
Mm-hmm. What do you want?
I want to be asked.
I'm sorry?
I want to be asked. I would like the community of people looking for housing.
No, I wasn't being facetious though. I mean, just tell us like what you're looking at and what you think should be done, yeah,
personally?
or just what you think should be done, yeah.
Well, survey is one way,
Uh-huh.
right, to get feedback, right? We vote,
Sure.
we have laws, we look at them, right? What are the options? We get to look at the options, right? We have to create the possibility ourselves.
Right. So the city government should be reaching out to neighborhood.
Yes,
Okay.
to the communities, to the people who are seeking the housing.
Who need the housing? Okay.
And anyway, another question is that I would like to see more community ownership of the housing. That
Okay.
there's more equity ownership by the residents who live in the properties.
Okay.
And for those, I mean,
Like a co-op kind of a style, or
yes,
community land trust.
and if people want to pay rent, pay rent. But it seems like a much more progressive model to have residents own where they live.
Sure. And there's some alternative models like that, but it's hard, to scale them. But it's important to do that, where you can, when you have the opportunity in a community to bring together like-minded people to try to do that.
Well, that's the essence of.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, she was saying we need more engagement with local residents who are seeking the housing, and she was suggesting that the local government could engage to see what they're looking for. Could there be an opportunity for some kind of a co-op or more equity?
The local, okay.
Yeah, that was her suggestion for another way to. And there are some creative approaches like that with community land trusts or co-ops and that kind of thing. But she'd like to see it on a broader scale, I think, and working with the local government. Yeah. So why have construction costs increased so much more than the rest of the country? Are there ways we can mitigate these increases? Yeah, so that's a tough one, and it's not. I think it's not just in California. So we've had natural disasters, hurricanes, fires, floods. Number one. I think many of you know we had a tariff on Canadian lumber, which wasn't a big source of the cost drivers, but did have some influence. there's a lot of interest in commercial and office, as I said, which takes workers away from housing production and that which is more profitable. In many cases where you have a union GC, you may even have, or you have public works projects where you have a project labor agreement, much more attractive for labor. So everyone gravitates toward the commercial, right? And we do have a worker shortage. We had a lot of workers who, after the Great Recession, in some cases left California altogether, who had been in the construction industry when it was just dead. And you had, contractors who went out of business, you had consolidation of the industry, et cetera. And so we do have a real labor shortage, and we also just have a misallocation in that sense. If you're trying to solve the housing crisis, a lot of it is on that side. But so you're seeing cost increases. There's lots of demand around the world for those same materials that we're all competing for in some cases. There are also limits to what we can do in terms of harvesting, wood products and just things that we can create in California ourselves. So oftentimes it has to come from outside of California because of our environmental regulations and requirements for certain materials. And even apart from construction, though, land is also very, very costly. The approval processes are long, which also is an additional cost. So when you add all those up, that's why you can see that if you have to go through that process as a market rate developer, you're going to charge the maximum that you can. And we have such a backlog of not building housing. And you have, as we had seen on that previous chart, you have all these high-income workers looking for housing. That's the segment that you're going to serve. That's the only way you can do that and make a pencil. That's why you need subsidies to do the more deeply income targeted housing, because you have to deal with all those same costs in terms of labor, materials, approval process, et cetera. And this, you can only get the deeply income targeted with subsidies. California is an expensive place to live. It's also a very beautiful place and people want to be here. But that means there's tremendous demand for the finite amount of land. And as you know, we have lots of land locked down in open space. We love our open space and we all want to protect that. But that means we need to do infill development. So if you're a true environmentalist, I think the Sierra Club's finally kind of coming around on this. They finally get it now. You got the NRDC's already there. You need to do the infill. You need to do the more density. You need to do ADUs. Unless you're just anti-human and don't want the population to grow or whatever, which could be possible too. But misanthropy solves a lot.
So maybe just to help you along, I'll just group a couple questions. So the next one is, how does infrastructure fill in, particularly with utilities, water, sewer, schools is typically a question, and so is just being able to keep up with services.
In terms, so you mean how
as housing comes online, how do we keep up with that as a community so that it doesn't overwhelm individual cities?
Sure. So the question is about impact fees in particular, and how when a new development pays for the impacts that it creates, new water and sewer capacity, generates traffic, all the rest of it. But so does commercial development. And what we also often hear, for some reason, at the Planning Commission and City Council, there's far less controversy when you're going to build new office. The council chambers are just not filled up to oppose that typically. Now, in some cases, if you have a neighbor, they may be concerned about traffic. But when you do new housing, everyone comes out in opposition. They talk about impacts on schools, et cetera. And I just want to be clear that we're not opposed to paying impact fees. We think that's the right thing to do, of course, and you have to do that because you want a thriving community. You want to make sure that you're paying your way, and you're providing funding needed for those upgrades to infrastructure, the new water mains, and everything else that you need to do that. And quite frankly, many jurisdictions just have fewer resources to be able to do that for we call it the capital improvements program, which is all the kinds of improvements they want to make across the city. They need to figure out how to pay for that. We used to have more federal participation. I think CDBG's been significantly reduced, community development block grants from the federal level for infrastructure. So we have to come up with our own ways. Redevelopment was eliminated in California. That was the way we used to do those kind of set the table, those infrastructure investments. You would assemble parcels, you would do brownfield remediation, you would do all that kind of thing to kind of prepare so that when you did bring in development, it was actually an asset to the community and not a liability in terms of cost. And school impact fees are a part of it. You got to provide those facilities. One of the challenges we have now on the peninsula and in the valley is that you actually are closing schools because enough younger families with children can't afford to live here, that the ADA, the average daily attendance, is actually falling. It's reducing the funding that the schools receive from the state. So that's another challenge that we have here. And obviously teacher recruitment's a part of that. That's one of the reasons you're seeing teacher strikes up and down the state right now, is that no matter what kind of salary increase you're able to get to the teachers, it's not going to be enough to live here. And that creates all kinds of other societal problems. So that doesn't deal with infrastructure, so I don't know why I got on that, but in some ways it's all related, because the impact fees for the schools are just for to house the new students that you're bringing as an impact. But just as an aside, the Turner Center at UC Berkeley did a study. It was a brief kind of a white paper on. They chose, as I recall, 7 jurisdictions across the state, and just looked at the variance of the impact fees. And I think one city it was like $30,000 per door, and another city it was $120,000 per door. I think it was Irvine was the one that was at the highest, 130 or something. And so that's why the state's getting involved now. Now obviously there are differences in communities in the cost of acquiring right of way, and that which is driven by land costs. It's going to be different here than it is in Bakersfield or something, yes. But is there a methodology where there is kind of a level playing field? We had to decide on what that methodology is for determining what those costs and the impact should be. And that's kind of the work that's happening at the state level now, because some jurisdictions, once again, also use fees as a way to kill projects. And you can get a consultant to write a nexus study for any amount that you want. And it may not have a feasibility study to go along with it that really determines what the fee should be, and then sometimes litigation arises out of that, et cetera. Or it's just not clear what the fees are because there's a lack of transparency, and then you get hit with additional fees throughout the development process, and that creates additional challenges. So it's not that we want developers to get a pass. We just want them to know what the rules are ahead of time at the beginning, what those fees are, and to have the confidence that those fees really reflect the impacts that new development is making, particularly housing on the community.
So 2 questions related to transportation. One is, are there any ideas for viable public transit within the next few years to support Element 5? And what, if anything, does the CASA Compact do to address transportation issues?
So that was one of the criticism, I think, of CASA, was that it didn't deal with transportation directly, although it was the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in part who was driving this. And so I think they felt like they cover in their day jobs, they cover the transportation piece. But I would say transportation also is underfunded. Typically that's a problem. And then this whole debate about high-speed rail, you've probably seen where the governor appeared to be backing off a bit. I don't think that was his intent. I think he wanted to get people focused on it and make sure you get that first segment built, because you always can expect cost overruns. We saw that certainly with the Bay Bridge, for example, significant cost overruns, like to the tune of about $4 or $5 billion. But because we get that built, and then see what the potential is for other investors to come in and build out the rest of it, because that's where you'll have the real demand for it in particular, right? Once you get that built, is in the coastal areas in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I'm really excited about the electrification of Caltrain. Let's face it, we're in the innovation center, but Caltrain's just not up to par right now, right? I know friends of Caltrain are working on that, and so I don't want to be too critical, but and Adina will get me afterwards right now. But it's a little rickety, right, compared to what we see in Europe and Asia and some other places. We can do better, right? But it's got to be a priority, and so to us it all goes together. Transportation's housing, housing's transportation. Get the density, but you can't get people out of their cars if you're not providing a service that allows them to get to work on time or to make a meeting or to get where they need to go. They're just going to drive. And it's great if you're in a downtown, but what if you're a little farther off the main lines? How do you get around in that sort of last mile problem, et cetera, as they talk about, that makes it less convenient for people? Ongoing issue, but what we would say in general is that density in downtowns and along major arterials can actually make your transit work better. And we've got to do that, but this is not going to be solved overnight. You have to have decades of investment where you're getting the density in the right places, and you begin to beef up transportation, and people see the commitment to it, and then you're able to finally get them out of their cars. Plus, I think the younger generation is just done with driving, so that's a positive thing, and they're going to demand these kinds of investments and improvements in our transportation, public transit, in particular in that infrastructure.
This is kind of an interesting question, whether there will be differences regarding requirements or so sort of so for cities that have produced housing through local control and those who have resisted producing housing through local control, will there be any sort of differences in the requirements going forward?
And so, that's the tricky thing. You probably remember Governor Newsom, both when he was inaugurated and then when he had his budget release, and then also in the State of the State address, that he was really adamant about cities doing their fair share at the local level. He sued the city of Huntington Beach, who kind of blew off RENA, et cetera. He threatened to take gas tax for local streets and roads maintenance from jurisdictions. There again, I think it was kind of the same strategy around the high-speed rail to get people's attention and to get them to focus, because there are legal issues with kind of formulaic programs about taking that money, and particularly the voters have approved, et cetera. And he said, well, maybe find other sources. But I think the larger message he was trying to send was that it's not just optional. You can't just approve, you continue to approve commercial and office development, but it's just optional to do housing. And he wanted to get everyone back to the table. And we didn't have that kind of leadership on this issue from Governor Brown. And so I think he wanted to come in and set a new tone immediately, because it has become a crisis level. And it really is an equity issue, because we're losing our middle class, on this issue. But in general, what I'd say, it's difficult to come up with those ideas, but I think definitely I know that Governor Newsom wants to reward the good actors. And in his budget, he actually includes, in essence, grant funding that would be available for jurisdictions who are trying to meet their RENA numbers, et cetera, and making progress on that. And then the idea would be to have fewer strings on that, kind of like the CDBG program, which is that's the local money that jurisdictions want, because they can program it for their priorities, for infrastructure and other things that citizens demand. And to kind of be a reward system as well as the punishment. And I think he'll eventually get there. I mean, the difficulty is cities will always say, well, we only can plan for the housing. We can't actually produce it because we're not the developers. But many cities actually put all kinds of obstacles to even doing the proper planning or allowing, for the approval process to work. And so those are the ones I think you really want to try to identify. And I think that's a smart approach. That's eventually where he'll end up. But I think he wanted to get people's attention first and then say, come to the table and we'll talk about that. And I know the League of California Cities has taken a very different tone this year in the Capitol, and they're saying we want to come to the table and work with you on this, and not just saying hell no, which is a refreshing difference, I think, now.
So there's two questions that are slightly different, but it's about existing housing or existing building stock. And so the first kind of addresses a concern that I know a lot of people around here have, which is, what about the many houses that are sitting empty? And if the CASA Compact is going to address this idea of it, sort of investor owned properties. Mm-hmm. And then the second is what can be done, especially as the retailing space changes. What can be done to convert some of these retail properties into more mixed use type housing and mixed use.
And corporate campuses, right?
Yeah, right, there you go.
Yeah, so which one should I take first, do you think?
Whichever you want.
In terms of there's vacant tax kind of proposal, vacant property tax proposal that Oakland had one that they adopted. That's kind of in litigation now about which voter threshold was appropriate, et cetera. But I think it's also tied in, for example, the Airbnb kind of debate about, are we using housing as an investment or as a business to compete with hotels, and it's taking up these housing units that could be available for our working folks here, and that's why people are wanting to limit these kinds of Airbnb types of products, and there's vacant homes used as investment. And if you're going to do that, I mean, it's hard just to obviously through eminent domain just take the home away, which would be, I guess people would call that Stalinist, right? But the idea is, could you create a better tax incentive for people to use those properties, as rentals, and to make sure that they're serving the purpose for which they were intended, for which they were approved by local government. I think that's what local government wants to see. It was the same kind of challenge we had when there were a bunch of foreclosures and you had a bunch of empty homes. They created a real hazard for local jurisdictions to try to address. People, had left the home, and it created all kinds of health and safety issues over time with those houses. And so I think jurisdictions are looking at ways to incentivize that. Some people talk about Henry George's idea of the land value tax as a way to also get at some of those issues. I'm a big proponent of that, but the politics of it, hopefully over time, shift. But it would encourage, you would set up a tax system that would encourage the highest and best use, of real estate rather than sitting on it as an investment because of the benefits, under Prop 13 and how property is reassessed when title changes hands, et cetera. And so there's sometimes there's a tax incentive to underutilize underutilized properties. Let me
So
just make sure I caught everything else in that question.
Did you grab the retailing question?
Did I carry this one? Given this okay too? I think I did. Okay. So yeah, retail. That's an interesting thing. We're seeing a lot of projects come forward that want to redevelop shopping malls, and that's I think a very positive thing. And I think that's why I also brought up the idea of corporate camps, where you have these large, properties, typically on major arterials and thoroughfares where there aren't a lot of homes around it necessarily, but it could be a great place to do those kinds of apartments, et cetera, if you can get the appropriate financing. So that would be one idea. The other issue about retail, just because it's changed so much, is that, historically you had city council, or more, historically new urbanist kind of councils who wanted to have ground floor retail in every development, but that's really hard for affordable housing, and we actually don't think that's always the right solution, because that's just an additional issue and risk for an affordable housing developer to try to find the right tenants and to maintain them. And of course, everyone wants Whole Foods on their ground floor, and there are only so many of those that can go around. So we think it's better just to maximize, particularly for affordable housing, not to have the ground floor retail, but to have it in a place where it's served by neighborhood, commercial or retail, or where there is shopping that's available. And try to centralize that and make sure that's where you get the good transit, where it's walkable, or you can take the bike or transit to those kinds of shops. But I do think the whole issue of retail and how we do that, it also has implications for our tax structure, and do we expand the sales taxes that were applied, to various services, et cetera. That's an ongoing discussion that Senator Hertzberg and others have been having about just how we tax property and sales taxes and where those go. The debate came up obviously with Amazon as well in terms of its expansion of their distribution centers here in California as well, and online versus brick and mortar, and how the tax comes back to California now, where previously it hadn't done that. Other states don't necessarily have that, and so they're again paying for your impacts. That's part of the key to this as well. But so I do think that making those shopping centers available and having council willing to rezone those and allow that to happen is a really smart thing to do, particularly where you have a finite amount of land available.
Can you repeat what you said about ground floor retail?
Yeah, we shouldn't require that for affordable housing.
We shouldn't. Why?
No. It makes it more challenging for an affordable developer because they're not in that business, and they have to try to find the right tenants. They have to work with the council who wants a particular store in there. And the financing is more difficult because you have to finance.
In Redwood City, they have all kinds of ground floor and houses above.
Many jurisdictions have tried to require that, and it hasn't always been successful.
But are you talking about projects that are all affordable?
That's right. That's what I'm trying to say.
In Palo Alto, we
Yeah.
have a waiver for that, but otherwise we treasure our ground floor retail.
Yeah, so I'm talking about particularly 100% affordable.
More precise when you're talking, that would be helpful, because I think.
Okay, so I did say affordable.
Well,
And so what the issue is, you can't finance with housing subsidies, you can't subsidize the ground floor retail. And so it makes it more, so they have to go out and find other financing sources for that, et cetera. But the other thing I would say is that for affordable, the way you get tax credits and the way you're successful is you already have those amenities around you, to be able to score.
but we have a waiver for that, so
That's great. That's great. Because we do have examples where we had affordable require that, and then they had vacant storefronts, et cetera. They had to try to find, and it became a loss leader for them in essence, which is another burden on, what we're trying to do.
one size doesn't fit all, because different communities are different. That's
Right.
why sometimes this is difficult.
Yeah, and each site is unique and the whole thing, yeah, exactly. And location. Right, so that you want to restrict the sites where it makes the most sense, near transit and amenities.
Okay, so two questions related to tenant issues. So the first one, I'm a landlord, and I
Pause
use
for booze, it says.
no booze. We don't do booze. And there's a suggestion. Has CASA thought about requiring or developing standard leases, which spells out some of the tenant conditions spelled out in the CASA elements. So we could take that one first.
Okay. I'm not aware of additional work beyond the just cause that we had talked about. So I probably can't offer a lot additionally there, although I think would be something worth exploring. Obviously, the California Apartment Association would want to be at the table for that. And but maybe I'll just leave it at that. We just looked at the just cause in particular, which would be, those terms in your lease.
And then the second sort of renter protection related item is just given the folks at the table and at the so many industry players at this housing conversation, is there really a path forward for renter protection bills? Displacement's obviously going to be a challenge. Is there really a path forward for renter protection?
I think there is a shot. Obviously, it'll be an intense negotiation. I think ultimately it'll come down to Governor Newsom with equity and advocates and tenant protection groups and the California Apartment Association. And they tried to do some negotiations before Prop 10 actually went on the ballot last November. There was a bill which had been passed previously, which actually allows the sponsor of an initiative to pull it within 90 days if they come to some type of an agreement. Sometimes that's happened recently. That's kind of a fail-safe if you are able to reach an agreement. Because now people are putting ballot initiatives on just to get leverage in the legislature, actually, or threatening to do that as a way to get leverage. And so this was an opportunity then, if you do have that negotiation, then to go ahead and pull it and save some money and confusion. The reason I think it's different now is the crisis is so bad that you do even have market rate developers who, like in CASA, are saying, we're willing to take a look at this. There's a lot of momentum in the legislature, and I think the fact that Newsom has already clearly signaled he wants to deal with this, he also said in his budget, there's an opportunity to try to get something. The question is where, what that deal looks like. The California Apartment Association feels emboldened after the defeat 70-30 of Prop 10. And so they have, on the one sense, you would think they have less incentive to come back to the table, but I think that really, for the political pressure will be on them, they're going to have to come back. And I think that's why, Weinstein wants to have the threat of another measure out there to the extent that provides some leverage. But I know the equity advocates are really focused on this in the legislature, so I think they're looking for a package which would include just cause. What kinds of Costa-Hawkins repeals? It could be a rolling date, as I mentioned. I think that's in there where, buildings, I think, Bloom, started with 10 years, but you could see them going to, 15-year-old buildings. And then so 95 then moves up, to 2005, and then from there it just moves up, and more buildings then are come under that as the date advances. I don't think vacancy decontrol or control will be very difficult to get, but I think you could also get a statewide some kind of CPI plus some percentage of a cap on rent, because many jurisdictions, the bills I've seen would just return it back to local jurisdictions, and so you still either have to have your council vote for some kind of rent control, or you'd have to have it placed on the ballot by your local residents and then have voters approve. Will it make it? Some people say that's actually tougher than the rent cap. Yeah. So that's why I think they want to try to keep it as a package. And he'll probably have to take some amendments to the just cause. There are more than that. Yeah, there are many, exactly. And so that's all going to have to be hashed out, and it'll be like survival of the fittest, like who can make it through most committees, or with the fewest amendments. But so one of the debates, for example, was should the just cause kick in immediately upon tenancy, or should you have to wait a year? That for example, that's one that'll have to be debated. CASA said after 12-month tenancy. I think he'll introduce his bill immediate, just cause. But that's why they think it has to go as a package, because you're right. Otherwise, you'll pick off ones and then it won't really work.
Can you take maybe just two more questions? Sorry we can't get to all of it, but we want to leave a little time at the end so people
Sure.
can come approach you. There's an interesting question about what's the most productive role for private philanthropy to play, and what, if any, scale or ability can that be deployed?
Yeah, so what role does philanthropy have to play? Philanthropy? Yeah, and on that sources diagram that we had, they were a key player. They just announced this fund for the Bay Area, which includes Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the San Francisco Foundation, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and others who have come together. Facebook's involved. LISC is actually going to be the CDFI, which will Community Development Finance Institution, that will actually administer the fund. But the idea was to make investments both in local governments who want to adopt good policies, et cetera, to have some funding for that. And then also particularly for nonprofit affordable developers. And one of the first grants that they made, for example, was for the acquisition of existing buildings, and then to be able to, over time, bring those into regulated rents. So it could be a market rate unit. It could, it's of marginal value because of its location or because of its age, et cetera. Acquire the building, rehabilitate it, and then cap the rents, and then over time work them into a regulatory agreement through tax credits, et cetera, to maintain long-term affordability. And that's one model that, for example, they funded Ebaldsey in Oakland to do some of that, what we call acquisition rehab work.
Michael?
And they're also doing other kinds of loans.
Can I provide another reference to answer that question?
Yeah.
The Packard Foundation,
Good.
and maybe in collaboration with others, issued like a 30-page paper or report on how private philanthropy can support support solutions to the housing crisis. So if you go to Packard Foundation's website, you might be able to find it, and I can try to add it to our follow-up email. Okay.
Yeah, but it's general. So they're funding advocacy groups, they're funding good policies, and they're also funding actual development and acquisition of housing as well. And so playing those kinds of roles in a space where a traditional, bank wouldn't necessarily work in terms of the financing they can provide, and because of the dearth of resources in some cases at the local, state, and federal levels for some of the activities.
Okay, we have one last question, which is, how can we all help move forward the legislative agenda, and maybe an email list we can get on so you get timely action alerts or something like that?
Okay. Yeah, so I would say, I think I'm okay with this thing.
Oh, yeah.
So my former organization, the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, has a page on their website which will track a lot of these bills and actually provide you with fact sheets from the author's office so you can see what the intent of the author is. But then you can also have a link to where actually read the legislation if you'd like to do that. And then send in a template. There's a template support letter, so if you want to send in a support letter, you could download that and then fill it out and send it in. Or you could provide your own comments about what you feel about the bill, whether you support if amended, oppose unless amended, those kinds of things. And so you can engage that way. And then with my organization, also Silicon Valley at Home, we don't sponsor legislation, but we'll be involved in tracking at least some of these because our executive director was one of the co-chairs of the CASA process, Leslie Corsilia. And so we'll provide updates with our newsletters, et cetera, and provide you with links. But I'll also have my business cards, and if folks want to follow up, like I say, almost 200 bills this year. Some of them will be of marginal utility, but many of them will be very important. But many of them won't make it, or they'll become 2-year bills. And so, it's just a winnowing process, and eventually we'll end up with I think, a good package of really meaningful bills this year, and it would be great to have our community engaged and out there to support. If you want to go up to Sacramento, maybe you want to watch some of these hearings about Just Cause and rent cap. They'll be pretty exciting things to watch, certainly, and engage in.
Okay, I just want to say thank you. This was
Thank you.
wonderful, and you should have a big glass of water now, I think.
I will, yeah. or something stronger, right? Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming. We can hang around for a little while. There's still some snacks on the table, and look for a follow-up email, and hope to see you at our next something or other.